What's going on, everybody? Welcome into this Sun Belt Syndicate, specifically the Round Ball Roundup, presented by the Dogs Media Network, part of collegefootballdogs.com. We are proudly presented by W Energy. See the promo code down below. Try a little bit of that energy beverage that they've got. A little different than anything you just go and grab off the shelf at the store. These things aren't carbonated, so you don't have to keep them in any certain situations. A little tub of powder. You make it as you go. Again, they do have the recommended dosage. You probably treat it like a little bit like Kool-Aid, where you go a little heavier if you like it a little sweeter, maybe a little lighter if it's a little bit of a strong flavor. But they've got plenty of flavors to choose from. They just released a limited edition one that's going off the shelves fast. So be sure to use the promo code SB Syndicate at checkout to get you a little discount on the way out. Throw us a little appreciation, I guess you could call it, for checking out the show and checking out some of their stuff. So we had quite a week in the Sun Belt. Before we get started here, some surprises, I would say. Had some teams kind of jump up a little bit and some teams go down a little bit. So we'll have to see where that stands after we go through everything here. But let's check it out. Go ahead and get this up on screen right now. So as we said, Round Ball Roundup, I called this one the Gaps Closing. For those of you who checked out the thumbnail before we got going today, you can tell that there is no longer any undefeated teams within the conference. So that's why I called it Gap Closing, because now that there isn't a head and shoulders team above everybody else, it feels a little different this week than it did last week already. So let's go over a quick review from this past week, starting with Saturday, where we had App, Troy, and Georgia State all win their games. App and Troy winning pretty comfortably. Georgia State's game a little closer. We'll talk about the game specifically here in a minute. We also had ODU and ULM stay winless. They were trying hard to get into that win column. It did not happen Saturday for either team. Marshall takes their first loss of the season. As we said, no more undefeated teams. Marshall was one of those teams coming in to the weekend, but they are no longer after Saturday. Cajuns and Jags look more like last year's versions. Probably not exactly like last year's versions, but again, as we've covered a couple times already, these are the two teams that ended up in the conference championship for the tournament. And so when they're rounded into form here, they could go on a roll, could get scary for some of these other teams in the conference. Wednesdays and Thursdays games, we had the Cajuns start a run with a big win again. So, yeah, Cajuns 2-0 on the week thus far. Golden Eagles rebound from a really bad loss on Saturday and get back into the winning ways there on Thursday. I think it was Thursday that they went. Or it might have been Wednesday. Well, we'll get to that one in just a second. Troy and Marshall both get upset. So Marshall doesn't have the greatest of weeks, not winning a single game yet. And they've got a chance on Saturday to change that going forward. The Dukes start slow, but rebound at home over the pesky Warhawks. But again, in the end, winning a little bit comfortably there. So jumping into the games, we had three really close games on Saturday. App State takes down JMU 59-55. The Dukes cold from three, and App was pretty good defensively down low with 7 total blocks in the game, led by Justin Abson with 12 points. But it was the big performance off the bench from Miles Tate, who actually led all performance. So Justin Abson didn't lead the team, I'm sorry. But Miles Tate led the team off the bench with 15 for the Mountaineers. Terrence Edwards for JMU did end up leading all scorers in the game with 19 points. However, obviously not enough there as App State takes that one. Arkansas State goes down to the Cajuns 84-77. I put this one down not really as close as the score looks, but credit to the Red Wolves for getting it put away, or not letting it get put away, I'm sorry, because they were down by 14 points with just over 3 minutes left in the game. So they kept fighting back, and again, probably not quite as close as that score kind of looks there, but you never really knew, because basketball is a weird game because of timeouts and fouls. You can close that gap very quickly, and that's exactly what the Red Wolves were fighting back to do. obviously a little bit too little, too late in the end there, and the Cajuns end up taking that one. And Hosanna Katange goes off for 25 points to lead all scorers. Caleb Field goes for 19 in the losing effort. We also had the Bobcats taking care of ULM 67-54. Not really a tightly contested battle in that one. And we had the Coastal Carolina Chanticleers taking down ODU 79-75. So as mentioned, ODU at that point still had yet to get on the board as far as a win in conference play is concerned. Jumping into the other games on Saturday, there was 3 more games, as we know. All 7 games or 14 teams usually go every Saturday unless something crazy happens. I think that's pretty much the way it is the rest of the year. Wednesday and Thursday is obviously split up a little bit more. But South Alabama joins just 3 other teams in conference, which would be Troy, Arkansas State, and actually Georgia State, for scoring 50 points in the first half of their game against Marshall, beating them 91-85 in that one. Both teams had 2 players go over 20 points in the game. For South Alabama, that was Gator and Jones, and for Marshall, it was Anochili Killen and Crawford. The entire stat line, was extremely close in this one. The only real separation favored the Jags was turnovers and steals. And obviously in a tightly contested battle, those things come down to the wire. That's where your little tiny different. I'm talking most everything was barely different across the board, except for those turnovers and steals. So got to take care of the ball a little bit better there if you're Marshall, and get what looked like a very winnable game going into that one. But again, they come away with a loss because of how the Jags played in that one. We also had Troy easily dispatching Southern Miss 82-56. Not necessarily a surprise that Troy takes that one with where they had been in conference. I would say it was a surprise with the score output from the Golden Eagles there in that one. 82-56. I mean, that's not even a real tightly contested battle. We've got Yo Boy Carr saying, "What's up?" Our resident Cajun fan, as he continues to come back every week for both football and basketball. We appreciate that very much. The Big Ten backers also jumping in. Dominic with the Sun Belt round ball. Let's go. Nice to see you guys both joining in. Appreciate you guys catching the show tonight as we go through it. We also had Georgia State taking care of Georgia Southern 90-62. Before the week started, I said this one could be close because you never know with these 2 teams. You don't know in football, you don't know in basketball, and I would not have predicted a 90-62 scoreline in this one. However, that's what we got. So again, you just never know. This could be a 1-point difference, or this could be a blowout win. And of course, in this one, it went the way of the Panthers, and they easily dispatch their hated rival, I guess, because I think that they think that rivalry is more heated than the Southern fans do. You guys can chime in with both of those if you want to talk about that one. I believe Georgia Southern believes App State is their true rival, as App State believes Georgia Southern is pretty much their true rival. Obviously, the older generation believes it is Marshall, and I think the newer generation believes that it's Coastal Carolina even. So you never know. Everything keeps changing with how fans believe things are going. So interesting to see those dynamics over the years as I've been a fan and followed along. But yeah, this one is definitely one that the Panthers always want to win, and Georgia Southern never wants to lose. So even if they don't consider themselves both the biggest rivals, neither one of them wants to lose this game. Jumping into Wednesday's score, App gets by a pesky Georgia State team, 76-68, behind 23 points from Spillers in that one. The Cajuns easily dispatch the Bobcats 86-68, continue on their roll as we talked about to open this show. 2-0 this week, looking good going into Saturday's play. They had 5 players in double figures, and they were led by Kobe Julian. But the game of the night was easily Arkansas State and USM. Golden Eagles take it 69-66, due in large part to Austin Crowley's 25-point performance, but a lot of attention towards the officiating at the end of this one, whether you believe it was a charge or a foul or neither. I don't know. But as we know, basketball officiating is questionable, not just in the Sun Belt. Let's be fair to everything here. I think no matter what conference I've been watching, I hear people talk about the officiating. As a former official, not of basketball or football, it was actually soccer, for those that care about that. But it is a difficult thing to do, and there's a whole lot that plays into it. But yeah, you still, even in the profession and having time spent there, you still want these guys to do better and hopefully have better outcomes where it doesn't become much of even a talking point. Unfortunately, in that one, it certainly was. So hopefully some things tighten up, can be looked at and reviewed. Obviously, you can't really do that live. Well, actually, nowadays, you can do anything you want live reviewing, but they have rules against whether you can overturn something or just look for something more in the call that you did make. So, obviously, if a guy needs to get thrown out for something that looked a little less harmless in the moment, but when you review it, it was more of a punch or something else. So that rounds out Wednesday's scores. Getting into Thursday's, in a complete shocker, the Monarchs easily take care of the visiting Thundering Herd, 91-66. So not only is it a shocking outcome in the win-loss aspect, but to me, 91-66. I would have never thought they would have pulled out a victory as big as that over a team that was rolling as well as Marshall. Obviously, Marshall had lost earlier in the week in that Saturday matchup, but you still think a team that had yet to win a game in conference wasn't going to be able to come in and beat up, a team like Marshall that badly. They were led by the new leading scorer in the Sun Belt, Vashawn Allet's 27 points. So obviously that is a large part of that 91 total and makes it a little bit more obvious about why that game went the way it did. But still, again, would have never called that one before this week started up. ULM up 22-12 early against the Dukes, but they come roaring back thanks to 31 points from Wooden. And they actually win that one easily in the end, 89-70. I'm not even on that page yet. Oh, yeah, I am. Man, getting confused. I'm looking all over. So yes, 89-70. But yeah, going down early. When I first saw the scoreline on that one, I jumped over to it quickly because I almost thought ESPN had it wrong. ULM's capable of these types of games, though, I will say. Last year, they did the same thing they kind of did this year, which was enter conference play not with any kind of impressive record outside of the conference. So they did that last year, but then they got better once the conference play kind of started rolling, and they were one of the more formidable teams. I think they kind of ended up towards the middle of the pack, but still not a team that people could go up and beat easily at any point in the season. This year, maybe the same could have been true, because they kind of came in with the same type of unimpressive record outside of conference play. But conference play starts going, and you think they can start turning the corner here. But that has not been the case for ULM as they continue to struggle thus far. Georgia Southern and Coastal play close battle, but shots and free throws towards the end of this one were really not easy to come by for either team. The Eagles win it 73-70 after 19 points from Banks. But again, these two teams not towards the top of the conference, and the end of this game was exactly a reason why. It was kind of those little things, right? Small outside jumpers, not even three-point shots, not falling, stuff that should have easily been made. Definitely some free throws on both sides of the court that were left with no points, that could have easily either put the game away for Georgia Southern or got the game a lot closer for Coastal Carolina. Again, it was kind of an ugly finish, but a close game. So, one that you could definitely watch and be interested in up until that little, disappointing ending, I guess you could say. Troy and South Alabama, as we know, these two schools, these two teams do not like each other whatsoever. And South Alabama actually ends up giving Troy their first loss in conference play, 74-71. Tightly contested battle, but the Jags had 4 players in double figures, led by Samuel Taib's 19 points. Jags take it Again, 74-71 in that one. That will round out everything we've seen up until this point. So now we're going to roll into Saturday's games. But first, let's take a look at the standings. I tried to do something a little different this week with the standings. Obviously, the same kind of mapped out look that we've had, so you can see everything all at once. But I did put some red arrows, whether a team is trending up or down compared to last week. So Troy, even with the loss, stays atop the conference with their tiebreaker over App State with the head-to-head at this point. With a 5-1 record, 11-7 overall. App State trending up after this past week's performance. 5-1 as well in conference. Again, head-to-head loss to Troy keeps them below them. But a better overall record at 14-4. So keep an eye out for App to try and continue to climb the ranks if Troy slips up again. Southern Miss 4-2 now in conference. They are in the same spot they were last weekend coming into Saturday's play. 10-8 overall on the year. James Madison, the ranked team, the only ranked team we had coming into the season. Well, not coming into the season. After the very beginning of the season, they became ranked. They are actually sitting at fourth place within the conference thus far. 4-2 record, 16-2 overall, though, so still an amazing mark overall record-wise, but easy to see why they had some success early. They did have one of the weaker out-of-conference schedules up until conference play started, and even though this conference is not necessarily the strongest in basketball, at least as of yet, it is getting better, and it ain't easy. It is not an easy conference to win. We saw that last year. Southern Miss takes the regular season title and then doesn't even end up in the conference championship game for the tournament. That's not really abnormal across the board. But again, it just goes to show that just because you're the favorite going into something doesn't mean you're going to stay there at the top. And that's also evident this year as James Madison started out a big, clear favorite across the board, across the country, and now sits in fourth place just a few weeks into Sun Belt play. Georgia State, not the greatest week for them. They did have the big win, but then they had the big win against Georgia Southern. But they also had the loss. So they actually dropped one spot here and go 4-2 and 9-8 overall. Marshall, again, 0-2 on the week. Also 4-2 and 9-10. So they actually have a losing record overall. They were really looking to flip that with their great conference mark before these two losses. With that 4-0 start, looked very impressive, very promising, really where Marshall wanted to be, just like they were last year at this time. But two straight losses, and one of them pretty badly to ODU there, the one that we talked about as a shocker. So not doing themselves any favors in that. But somebody who is doing themselves some favors, the Ragin' Cajuns jumping way up this board, now with a 3-3 mark on the season, 10-8 overall. So looking pretty good if they can get that conference record up a few more games. They definitely got some players getting hot at the right time. I expect them to continue this trend upward for the time being. Arkansas State tied with them at 3-3 in the conference, but just 7-11 overall. So as they trend down, not the biggest shock with a team who came into the conference play with a losing record. We'll have to see if they can round back into form. They do have some excellent playmakers over there on the Red Wolves. Jags 3-3 as well, but a 10-8 overall mark. So they're trending up in a couple different ways. Definitely getting hot at the right time, just as the Cajuns above them. So be on the lookout for both of those two teams to make some runs. Again, the pedigree is there from where they ended up last year. I don't think it's a huge surprise to see them starting to kick the tires or whatever you want to call it in the upward trend this early in conference play. Georgia Southern, again, winless before they entered conference play, but now 3-3. So they're right there in the heat of it, but 3-15 overall. So they'll have to continue to step that game up and get those close battles, make sure they're putting those teams away and play a little bit better against some of the better teams. See what the Eagles can do here. Coastal Carolina, Texas State, both stay in the same place. Coastal one spot ahead at 2-4. Texas State sits at 1-5 overall, joined by a team that makes a tiny jump in ODU, also with a 1-5 record with that win, that big win over the Marshall Thundering Herd, and ULM staying winless thus far in conference play with the 0-6 mark. Again, they had a promising start there against one of the better teams in James Madison, but they let them come roaring back and end up taking the 6th loss of the season in conference play. So they remain in the basement at this point. Jumping into Saturday's games, the first game of the weekend is going to be Georgia State going up against Georgia Southern. A quick early rematch, really, in conference play, which is a good thing. I think that's going to add some heat and excitement to this game to be turned around and playing so quickly. We've seen it sometimes in the NFL for those division games where they only have a week or two difference and they're playing each other right again. It's great. It's going to be a little bit more exciting because of that. Again, the first game was not a close one. That's got to lead to this second game being a much tighter contested battle. But we shall see. Again, we don't really know what to expect in these. I would be surprised if the Eagles win it in blowout fashion. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a close game who it goes to, though, because, again, these two teams, schools in general, they both want this one bad. Troy goes up against Southern Miss. This one should be a great battle in here. Troy, again, one of the top teams, actually the top team in the conference as of yet, going up against Southern Miss, who's only 2 spots below them. And so Southern Miss having a pretty good week. Well, in the end, they didn't have a great week. They didn't have a great start to the week on Saturday with that performance, but they did rebound well during the week to take out Arkansas State. But again, there's a contested battle. This one should be interesting, though, as they continue to lock up with 2 of the better teams historically here lately in the Sun Belt. South Alabama against the Ragin' Cajuns. I just talked about how both teams are heating up at the right time with players also getting hot at the right time. This one, to me, is the matchup of the weekend. Plain and simply, I mean, maybe Troy and Southern Miss are right below there. But Southern Miss, sometimes we just don't know which team's going to show up, right? They've had some great games. They were the first team to take out James Madison, but then they've also lost in blowout fashion to Troy. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But South Alabama and the Ragin' Cajuns locking up. This one is a must-see if you're checking out Sun Belt basketball. One right after that, App State goes up against Coastal Carolina. This one should be easily in favor of App State, but we've seen them go to Conway before. Actually, I think this one is in Boone. But these two teams have some close matchups, but then also there's been some times where one of them just blows the other one out of the water. So this one will be interesting. If App's on their game, they shouldn't struggle here against Coastal Carolina. We already talked about Coastal's struggles when they went up against Georgia Southern and dropping that game because they couldn't hit some of the stuff towards the end of the game like they should be doing. We've got Texas State going up against Arkansas State. I favor the Red Wolves to get back on track in this one, but the Bobcats are trying to do the same, so could be an interesting matchup there. Marshall goes up against James Madison in what was one of the best early season games in the Sun Belt last year, as both teams were really hot at that time. This year, not as hot. Again, James Madison cooled off a little bit now that conference play has started, and Marshall's gone 0-2 on the week. So both teams looking to rebound and get back into the winning ways. Should be still a solid matchup. I expect James Madison to win this one, though. I just think after that big performance they just had, after a rocky start there in ULM, to come roaring back, or against ULM. I think the game was actually in Harrisonburg on that one. But, yeah, I favor the Dukes in that one with what I've seen thus far, and Marshall struggling just a little bit here lately. The battle for the basement is the nightcap, ULM versus ODU. With the way ODU has come on and poured it on versus Marshall with the top scorer in the Sun Belt currently on their team, I don't see any reason why the Monarchs aren't winning this one rather easily over the Warhawks. But again, Warhawks are struggling to get a win and looking for that first conference victory. So we'll see if they can pull that one off as we go into Saturday's matchups and finish off with that one as the nightcap. So going over the leading scores, we actually dropped one player from this list as you may know, last week, we had about 7 guys tied for the top 5 spots. Now we've only got 6. But Vashawn Alette has taken over for ODU. He's gone from 20.7 points per game just last week to an average of 21.6 points per game. So he jumps Tyron Moore of Georgia Southern, who drops 1 spot after averaging 21.5 points last week, drops just a little bit there to 20.3. Again, the red and the green here on screen aren't an indication of anybody in any form or fashion from me. It's literally just if you go up, you're green. If you go down, you're red. It's just all in fairness. Obinyak Anochili Killen jumps into this top screen. He was in the following screen with the other guys last week, but he jumps up after a pretty big jump here. It goes from 18.8 points per game all the way to 20.3 points per game, even though Marshall struggled this past week. Anochili Killen is not part of the problem there, as he's the third leading scorer currently in the conference. Isaiah Gator drops one spot for South Alabama after being third last week, goes down to fourth this week, barely drops in his average points per game, going from 19.3 to 19.2. So nothing really terrible there, but he does technically drop one spot. More of Anochili Killen really jumping him than really his play diminishing very much, with that just 0.1 points per game difference there. Rounding out the top five, we've got Austin Crowley from Southern Miss, goes from 18.8 points per game to this week averaging a even 19 points per game, and just incredibly impressive. If you haven't been checking out the Golden Eagles, definitely keep an eye out for this kid. One of the better talents in this entire league. Was easily one of the best players last year, top five without any question, maybe top three. And again, he's performing right where expectations were coming into this season. So a great season for Austin so far, and I'm sure he hopes to continue those ways as they get deeper here. Caleb Fields for Arkansas State, 18.8, just barely a drop there to 18.3 this past week, but he helps round out the top five scores for the men's side this week. Getting into the women's standings. Yeah, I don't include all the scores. Maybe I should. We'll see if there's enough interest to do that. But I definitely just want to give them some coverage here as we go along as well. Again, this one has a reddish pink background, so I definitely did not go with the red arrow. I wanted to go with something more readable. On this one, a lot of movement over here in the women's side, with only one team in the standings staying in the same place, which happens to be App State at 3-3, 9-8 overall. But Marshall and Troy, both with great weeks, going up in the standings. Marshall, a clean 6-0 at this point, a 12-5 overall record, followed closely by the Troy Trojans, 5-1, 8-8 overall, tied technically in the standings with James Madison at 5-1 as well. JMU with an out-of-conference or overall record of 13-5, though, so very impressive there, technically falling down a little bit in the standings after a loss this past week. ODU jumps up with a 4-2 conference record, 12-4 overall. And we mentioned this last week, but when you look at these overall records in the women's game or the women's side of the conference, much more impressive than the overall records in the men's side. So obviously the women, once again, performed very well out of conference before this conference play starts really heating up here. I guess it's really started to heat up just now here recently with all this movement as we're talking about tonight. But ULM 4-2 as well, right there with ODU, also moving up a little bit in the standings, 12-5 overall. Georgia Southern drops a little bit, very surprising because they've got one of the top scorers in the conference on their team, but they end up 3-3 after this week. 13-5 overall record, though. So again, a force to be reckoned with. Not an easy win for anybody here in conference. Right there with them now is Georgia State at 3-3, 9-7 overall. They jump up a little bit in the standings. The Red Wolves fall just slightly. They are now 3-3 with a 9-7 overall record, just like Georgia State. Ahead of them, we've already mentioned App State again, 3-3, 9-8 overall. Very close there with Southern Miss, who's now 2-4 in conference and 9-7 overall in the win-loss record as well. The Raging Cajuns jump up a little bit here, 2-4, 6-9. Texas State just 1-5, but 10-8 overall. So again, I think I mentioned this last week. They've got a winning record out here. They're struggling in the conference, which leads you to believe they've played some of the better teams thus far, and they might start to round into form. I thought that might happen this past week. Didn't really happen just yet. But, 10-8 overall, unless they had a really weak out-of-conference schedule, I can still expect them to start winning more games than they lose here. but we'll have to see, because 1-5 isn't a great mark, and if they don't get over that hump soon, it's not going to be easy to get out of that basement after a couple more losses. Coastal Carolina also sitting down there with them with a 1-5 record, 7-12 overall. So again, their struggles continue a little bit more than Texas State does. Again, with their overall winning record, Coastal and South Alabama doesn't have that kind of matching that men's side with a winless conference record thus far, going 0-6 so far in that play. So getting to their leading scores on the women's side, Dominique Davis jumps up for Southern Miss, going from 24.3 points per game. Actually, this one goes down, but she jumps up in spot. Let me be clear about that. She actually moves to the top of the Sun Belt Conference leaders in scoring, but her points per game does slightly dip from 24.3 to 22.8. Izzy Higginbottom, again, I love that name. She was third last week. She jumps up into second this week, going from 22.8 to 21.8. So again, just a slight dip there for the top two ladies. Taryn Ward, again, Georgia Southern struggled this past week a little bit. She goes from 26.5 points down to 21.8 points per game there for the Eagles. Faith Alston, I believe she's in the same spot she was in last week. Top four leading scorers in the conference thus far. She goes from 20.5 points per game to 20.8 points per game. So a slight jump up there for Faith Alston, and she's the only scorer who kind of jumps up. Although Michaela Tullivert and Janiyah Henson both jump into these rankings for the first time this season. Michaela with 19.2 points per game and Janiyah with 17.8 points per game to round out the top scorers in the women's side thus far this season. That about wraps it up. I'm glad everyone's joining us, checking in on the basketball. I know it's hard to keep up with anything more than your own team throughout the week because everyone's got busy schedules. Everybody's got stuff they're doing. So this is what this show exists for, is simply kind of a wrap-up show to keep you up to speed on the rest of the conference, that some of the action that you may have missed. So jump in here, talk a little trash, talk a little basketball, whatever you want to do. We've got the live stream going so that you guys can participate just like that to make this show a little more fun going forward. Again, we are presented by W Energy, down below SB Syndicate at checkout to give us a little change in the pocket, if you will. And once again, sponsored by the Dogs Media Network. Guys, thank you very much for joining me yet again, and we'll see you next week.
Sun Belt Syndicate.